Hello again, and today we're going to be talking about the sectional crisis, or roughly the 50 years of U.S. history between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. Now, you're going to need to stay with me because we're going to be covering a lot of material in a short amount of time, and it's going to seem to you like we're going a little fast. It's also going to seem to you that a lot of this is not connected, but trust me, it is, and I will explain everything as I go throughout the slides. This is going to be part one because this is way too much to talk about in one slideshow, so I have broken it up. And without further ado, let's go look at how we get from the War of 1812 to the Civil War. First of all, there's some misconceptions that you need to get rid of when you talk about the South. Many people think of Gone with the Wind when they think of the South, and that is really only 1% of the population. As it says here, 10% of the population only owns 90% of the slaves. In fact, most Southerners owned less than 5 slaves if they owned any slaves at all. And you look at this as the South as a tale of two worlds. So you have the Southerners who own slaves and are very wealthy, and they are your plantation class. They are direct descendants of the Virginian planters. They own most of the money in the South. Then you have this second class of poor white citizens who are subsistent farmers and who are basically working their own land if they own any, or they're working directly for the planters. This causes resentment, but again, I'm not trying to say that the poor people were less racist than the plantation owners, because as we know, they still actually want to be plantation owners because that is seen as the only way to make money in the South. So you really need to understand that about 10% of the population in the South is wealthy. They own multiple slaves. They are selling cash crops at a record pace. They are the ones who are the architects of the Confederacy. And then there's about 90% of the people in the South who are just subsistence people trying to get by, trying to eke out an existence, and they really do not own slaves. And of course, at this time, about 55% of the Southern population is 55% of the population is not slave, about 45% is. So there are still more white people in the South than there are slaves at this point. One thing that I do want to show you and make sure you understand is this bullet point right here. For the Southern planters, they made their money by selling their crops directly to the North and Europe. Any money they take or they put back into the plantations, there's not really a need to industrialize in the South because then you're cutting out your customer. So this is all great in 1790, but as it gets to 1860, the North is going to have more industrialization and more factories, and that is really going to play a factor in the Civil War. But you need to know at the South, they get a lot of money, but they don't really spend it on industrialization. Here's some more facts about slavery that we pretty much know about. This is pretty much taught in just about any social studies class prior to APUS. Many slaves do grow up in two-parent families. However, you could be sold off at any time. Your parents, children, especially when they reached puberty, could be sold off. Many slaves actually stay with the extended family, so you could have aunts, uncles living close by on the same plantation. And of course, slavery was seen as humane to many Southern plantation owners. That's kind of how they justified it in their mind, that, they could be, at least they were in the United States. They could be eking out an existence somewhere else. And there were actually free blacks in the South, but as it says here on the slide, Many of them were either enslaved via the fugitive slave law or forced to move. You'll notice here on the map that 1820, 1860, really there is a huge, huge bump in the usage of slavery. You'll notice that predominantly slaves are used in the deep south, so right along this ridge between South Carolina and Louisiana into Texas. There is slavery in some of the northern states, so like Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, but the predominantly area of slavery was this belt right here, and that's where cotton grew the best. Missouri, they do grow cotton, but it is not as widespread, and it's really only in this area that they grow cotton. So you'll see that a lot of the South plantations are right along this ridge, and there's another reason why that is because if you notice, not many slave plantations right along free state borders. That's because it's very easy for slaves to cross the Mississippi River or the Ohio River and go to freedom. So the southern plantation owners mostly tried to keep their areas way away from the north to kind of discourage revolts. Slave revolts did pretty much happen in the upper South. Again, that's right about here. And when you think about it, it's really simple because what's right next to the upper South? The North. However, something that you really need to understand is that the North really didn't support these slave revolts because they didn't want the slaves coming to the North and taking away industrialized jobs. There were two big favorable solutions. The American Colonization Society, so we're going to take these people that escaped to the North, pay for their passage back to Africa, and establish a Liberian colony. So the thought process here was that slaves would never reach equality with European descendant Americans, so just send them back to where they can have their own community. This is formed by William Lloyd Garrison. We'll talk more about him. And a big proponent of this was actually Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was one of the founding members of the American Colonization Society. And up until the 1850s, this was the method that he most endorsed over the abolishment of slavery. Of course, you also have the Underground Railroad, which you've probably learned about in elementary school or middle school. And a lot of those places on the Underground Railroad were in Illinois because we are right across the river from Missouri. The big revolution that tends to show up on the AP test is Nat Turner's Rebellion. They just made a movie about this called The Birth of a Nation. So Nat Turner is one of the few rebellions where slaves actually use armed rebellion against the plantation owners. It is squashed pretty quickly, and after 1831, you don't really see many big slave revolts because then the South really tries to cut down on teaching slaves how to read, teaching slaves how to write, and encouraging that they are human beings. And as we learn, slavery is part of the political frame of the United States well before this time period, but it really, really starts to come to a head in 1820. So in 1820, Missouri petitions to be a state, and they want to enter the Union as a slave state. This would upset the balance because at this point in time, there are equal amount of slave states as there are free states. In fact, it is 11 to 11 at this point. You don't want to upset that balance because the North is really afraid that the South is going to keep their voting power in the Senate. You look after the War of 1812, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio have been formed, and this is really a countermeasure to the South to keep them from taking over the government. They don't want Missouri to upset that balance. So what they do is they create the state of Maine. So Maine enters the Union as a free state. Missouri enters the Union as a slave state. So that makes it 12-12. And then what they do is they draw this imaginary line across the rest of the map from the Missouri border that says if you are a territory above this line, you cannot have slavery. So you think about it, all this territory up here in the Great Plains cannot be slave states. And you're leaving only this little bit right here that can be a slave state. So again, compromise is reached. The North feels that they've pulled a fast one on the South, and all is well in the United States. In fact, we call this area the era of good feelings. And it is the era of good feelings simply because there's only one political party. Remember, the Federalists and the Republicans have just been going at each other for the last 30 some odd years. The Federalists go away after the Hartford Convention, and there's only the Republican Party. There's also no major European conflicts during this time. The United States and Britain and France have really kind of cooled off relations. And this leads to the United States taking all that money that they were spending on foreign interventions and pumping it into the economy. And boom, we are successful. We have the Industrial Revolution happening. Everything's good. And of course, during this time, the United States government starts building railroads, steamboats, canals, and turnpikes, and really making it easier for a person to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Something prior to this time that would have taken as much as 6 to 8 months is cut down to 2 to 3 months based on advancements in transportation. We talked about the United States as not getting involved in foreign affairs. Let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine comes about in 1823, and there's this constant fear that Europe is going to come back to North America, specifically after Spain is kicked out with the Mexican independence. The Monroe Doctrine is big because it officially declares that we will not get involved with Europe in any conflict whatsoever. So Britain and France go to war. We're not getting involved. But the big part of the Monroe Doctrine is that Europe has to consult the United States before intervening in Latin America. So if Europe wants to come and start a new colony or intervene in a war or basically take over another country's territory, they have to ask the United States permission. Now, this is laughable because if you go along with our metaphor, this is basically a 20-something-year-old United States who has just granted adulthood and independence, telling their parents, stay out of my life, don't make my decisions for me, you can't come to my house, and if you do come to my house, you have to ask me. So it's kind of laughable to think that Europe would take orders from the United States. But they do issue the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, and this really is important because going forward, the United States is going to turn inward. So the United States is going to have a period of roughly 70 years where they're not expanding outward, they're not getting involved in foreign conflicts, and we deem this isolationist. The era of good feelings officially starts to end in 1824. So, quickly, if you would peruse this table with me, you'll notice that Andrew Jackson has more popular votes and more electoral votes, but he does not win the election of 1824. So, you might be asking me, how did that happen? Well, we call this the corrupt bargain. So, John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State who negotiated the Monroe Doctrine, who is John Adams' eldest son and is seen as kind of a nationalist Republican candidate who favors national rights. And Andrew Jackson, of course, is a hero of the War of 1812. He's seen as a man's man. He is of the common people. He cares about poor people. And he's seen as a states' rights person. And of course, you have Henry Clay, who is the great compromiser, who is the architect of the Compromise of 1820, also from Missouri, if I might add. He and these three individuals are all vying for the presidential election in 1824. What happens is that the electoral vote is split between four people. No one gets a majority, and the rich elite align themselves via John Quincy Adams. So the rich people align themselves behind John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay gives his electoral votes to John Quincy Adams and the support of the House, which, by the way, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. Where have we heard this before? And the House votes for Adams over Andrew Jackson. Now, a couple things come out of this. John Quincy Adams is seen as an illegitimate president. He's not really allowed to accomplish anything. And many states take away the land owning component of the voting requirements. So prior to 1824, if you didn't own land, you were not allowed to vote. Once the states get rid of this designation between 1824 and 1828, you'll see many more poor white males voting. So again, the corrupt bargain, Henry Clay gives the support of John Quincy Adams in the House to vote for him, even though he did not win the popular vote and the electoral vote. In exchange, Henry Clay is made actually Secretary of State. That hence the term corrupt bargain. And again, I just threw this map in for good measure because even though it is the era of good feelings, you notice that the United States is starting to become fractured again. You'll notice there's a pocket of the Federalist states that are voting for John Quincy Adams. You'll notice that a pocket of what used to be the Republican states are split between Jackson and Crawford. And there's kind of this new Western state coalition that is forming behind Henry Clay. And again, as these people are leaving the South and moving to Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, Tennessee, they're starting to not be as Republican as they were. They're starting to align themselves more with the North, and we'll see this as we talk about political parties going forward. The election of 1828, not as close on the map, but very close in the popular vote. So more people are allowed to vote during this election. And again, if you do not own land, you're allowed to vote. And you can see that overwhelmingly the common man votes for Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson really builds himself as a champion of the common person. John Quincy Adams is painted as this intellectual elitist who is rich and only cares about him and his rich friends. And Andrew Jackson really is allowed to form kind of like this populist identity, which again is ironic because just like Thomas Jefferson before him and presidents after him, Andrew Jackson is a rich person. He owns land. He is a real estate. He is nothing close to a common man, yet he's able to inspire this image of himself caring about poor people. I like this photo because Andrew Jackson comes into the presidency and he says that he has a mandate from the people to completely drain the swamp of Washington. Where have you heard this before? So Andrew Jackson says that he's going to fix the corruption in Washington, and he's not going to play ball with politicians, and he's going to do things for the common people who have forgotten by the politicians. Again, stop me if you've heard this before. Some key things about Andrew Jackson. First of all, the National Bank has come back under the era of good feelings, and one of the first things Andrew Jackson does is he tries to kill the National Bank. He sees the National Bank as an institution for rich people to basically take advantage of poor people. He doesn't like the fact that one institution is taking care of the country's money, but really what he doesn't like about the Second National Bank is that him and his buddies are not in control of it. So Andrew Jackson wages war on the Second National Bank. He doesn't renew the charter in 1835. He vetoes several bills trying to reestablish the charter, and it does not go well. He does kill the National Bank, but as his term sets to expire, Jackson kind of institutes other things that the National Bank was doing, just kind of when it owned by him and his friends. The specie circular was a big scandal during Jackson's presidency. There was new land that was opened up in Alabama, Mississippi, and Andrew Jackson worked some sort of backroom deal where his friends get to sell the land for the government. So they buy the land on the cheap from the government and sell it as speculators. Andrew Jackson is never officially linked, but his handprints are all over this, and many historians believe that this was just a scheme for him and his buddies, him and his real estate buddies, to make a ton of money on newly opened federal land. There's also the nullification crisis, which is 1837, and it involves the state of South Carolina. So the national government institutes a high protective tariff, and South Carolina doesn't like the tariff because high tariffs mean they cannot sell and import or sell goods to Europe and import goods back. So they threaten to secede from the United States. Jackson sends federal troops to South Carolina, and one day later, miraculously, they're back as a state. This is important because this shows that Jackson is a Federalist. He is more of a nation or national rights person than a states' rights person. And it shows for the first time that the federal government is willing to stand up to a state. So you'll notice prior to this, the states have really had control of the government. Now you've got a president who is standing up to the states. And this foreshadows the Civil War. Notice again, South Carolina is the state that secedes. South Carolina will be the first state to secede in 1860. Ultimately, what Jackson is most known for, though, is the Trail of Tears. So in 1830 and 1832, Congress and Jackson authorize an Indian removal from all lands east of the Mississippi River and organize an Indian territory in what is now Oklahoma. These peoples are forcibly marched out of their homes, and their land, again, like we said, is given at low prices to Jackson's buddies, who sell it to settlers for inflated prices. Now, there's a million ways that we can go that say this is just not right, but obviously Indian removal, we have a history of that, as you've seen prior to this, and it does not go well. Several millions of Native Americans die on the trail to Oklahoma, and of course Jackson benefits not only because he's getting rid of the Native American issue, but he's also making money off their removal. And this is kind of a way that a lot of people compare Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump. He's a very interesting person. He's very fiery. He's very antagonistic, and he kind of does whatever he feels like doing. And I wish we had several hours just to go over Andrew Jackson. But the big thing you need to know about him is that he is the first president that really kind of feels like it is the national government's right to put state governments in their place. And he's also what brings about the end of the Republican Party dominating politics, because there are so many people that don't like Andrew Jackson that they form their own party in opposition as he goes for re-election. The party that does form in opposition to Jackson is called the Whig Party. And you'll notice the Whig Party pretty much likes many of the things that the Federalists like. So this is kind of Federalist Party 2.0. The big thing about the Whig Party is that they're still not against slavery, but they do not support Indian removal. So they do not support Indian removal on moral grounds, and this is kind of a stepping stone towards not supporting slavery. The Whig Party kind of takes over for the Federalists, and what happens to the Republican Party is they officially change their name to the Democratic Republican Party, and then they just drop the Republican name altogether. So after 1833, you have the Whig Party and you have the Democrat Party, and this is the Democrat Party that we know today in America. Taking more, we go back to our map. And we said that, the North kind of thought they pulled a fast one on the South because there's really only Arkansas and Indian Territory that can be slave states. None of this area up here can be slave states. Well, that is about to change. So, war in Texas. After 1821, Spain is trying to get more people. And if you look at a map of Spain and Mexico, Mexico is highly populated towards what is now modern day Mexico. It is not very populated in what is modern day Texas, Arizona, California. And they want kind of a buffer between the Native American tribes of the Great Plains and the Mexicans who live in modern day Mexico. So what better way than to entice Americans to come and fight the Native Americans and die from the Native American raids. Starting in 1828, the Mexican government allows Americans to move to Mexico and become Mexican citizens. There's really only two things they have to do. Number one, they have to convert to Catholicism. And number two, they have to formally declare that they will no longer be American citizens and become Mexican citizens. So basically, you have to renounce your American citizenship and you have to convert to Catholicism. This becomes a problem because many of these Americans take their slaves with them to Texas, even though Mexico formally has outlawed slavery, and this is going to be a problem that eventually leads to war. Now, fun fact about the Texas War, originally the Texans asked Andrew Jackson to support them. Andrew Jackson says, I cannot have my handprints on this. So he gives them money, but he does not give them troops. He does not give them ammunitions. He does not give them U.S. support. Here are some of the key people of the Mexican Texas War. Obviously, Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston. There are major cities in Texas named after them. Of course, Davy Crockett was part of the Alamo. And of course, here are some of the key events. Remember, the Alamo is a fight of about 250 Texans versus 4,000 Mexican soldiers. And of course, this is where the saying, remember the Alamo, comes from. And really, there's only one major victory for the Texans, and it's the last battle. So the story goes is that the Mexican army is camped near the San Jacinto River. The Texans sneak up upon them, and Santa Anna, who is the leader of the Mexican army and also the president of Mexico, is shaving. He obviously doesn't put up a fight, and they take him hostage. In exchange for his freedom, he grants Texas their freedom. And Texas immediately petitions for statehood, but they're denied. And let's look at why they are denied as a state. First of all, Santa Anna gives them freedom, but he doesn't. But they can't agree on where the boundary for Texas is. The Texans want a river that is 200 miles south of the Rio Grande River. The Mexicans want the Colorado River, which is significantly farther north than the Rio Grande River boundary that is today. Obviously, the United States can't allow them to become states because then they would have to admit that they were part of the independence. Andrew Jackson can't have that happen, so he quietly pushes for their denial. And of course, we'll go back to a map here, but you'll notice that the boundary of Texas goes above the 3630 parallel, which is the southern Missouri border. Therefore, they can't have slavery. But number 4 is the big reason why Texas is not immediately admitted as a state. Texas would give more slave states than there would be free states, and it would really, really upset the balance because Texas eventually might have more people and different states, and you can't have that. We'll take a look at this picture in class, but manifest destiny is this whole idea that it is our God-given right to possess the North American continent from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean. And there's a lot of things going on in this picture. We will look at it more in class. Part of the manifest destiny is taking the territory north of Mexico that is claimed by the British. Again, we don't like the British being in North America, especially when we feel that at any time they could come back. Oregon is a big deal because we almost go to war with Britain over Oregon at the last second. We sign a treaty that splits the boundary of Oregon in half. But again, we almost had a third British war, even though we are somewhat neutral because we are fighting over Oregon. And this is where the boundary is today based off of this treaty in 1846. The last piece of the puzzle is the area west of Texas. So, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. The United States basically invades Mexico and kind of invents a phony reason for why they did. One of the biggest ones is that Texas becomes a state, and they still have not decided where the territory is. And of course, the United States Manifest Destiny wants to occupy all of Mexico because this is all territory that is south of the Missouri border. So the more territory that we get from Mexico, the more territory that is open to slavery. And of course, the South really, really, really supports this war. And again, it's not really much of a war because the United States basically just invades Mexico. In fact, in Mexico, it is known not as the Mexican American War, but as the War of American Aggression or the American Invasion. And that's basically what we do. The war is over in 1848 after we invade the Mexico City and force a treaty. And of course, you look at the conditions of the Mexican American War, and really we ask ourselves, why did the United States even fight this war? So Mexico gives up unclaimed the Rio Grande River, and they give up New Mexico, California, Arizona, and of course the United States pays $15 million. And you're thinking about that is less than what the United States paid for the Louisiana Purchase, and it's more territory. So after all this, the United States invades Mexico and basically forces upon them a sale of land for $15 million. And going back to our, and of course, the results of the Mexican American War are as follows. Um, the big one, though, is this one right here. So, of course, all of this territory is south of the Missouri border. What are we going to do with it? Is it going to be slave territory? Is it going to be free territory? And of course, this is what is going to spur the biggest debate between the North and the South, because all of these territories would be territories that would favor the South. And of course, we'll learn more about how this affects the balance of power going forward. But again, these are the big issues that happened between 1815 and 1850, and we'll talk about the 1850s in the next part of the video.